Okay, so we're starting now with Jason. So this is the last speaker before we go over into our movie. Um, yeah. Okay, Jason, over to you.
Okay, you might not be able to tell from the title, but this little talk is about printing. And in preparation for it, I was looking back a little bit on the history of printing, and a lot of stuff had to go on for people to figure out how to do this. And so there must have been quite a strong motivation for people to figure out these quite complicated processes, which involve chemicals in all sorts of ways. I don't even know how some of these people came up with these things. They involve so many steps. And the one thing I was really surprised about is how much longer the history of printing and, in a certain sense, photography goes back than I thought it. And I mean a really long time. We're talking about maybe, in a certain sense, you could say it goes back to Paleolithic cave painters. And there are theories by people that theorize about these things that cave paintings from 10, 20, 40,000 years ago were influenced by natural phenomena that we today would view as a type of photography. And I can kind of picture the scene like this and how this was discovered. Like 10,000 years ago, there are a whole bunch of hunter-gatherers standing around the fire, and there's a meteor shower streaking across the sky. And they're all standing there watching this amazing thing. They're probably in awe and probably quite scared as well, wondering what this means. But there's one person that isn't there. And I'm sure he must have been a distant ancestor of Terry's because he's gone to bed. But he is actually watching the same scene on the side of his tent, projected through a small hole in the animal hide and the other side of his tent. He sees exactly the same image playing out, albeit upside down. And so Terry's many times over granddad actually discovered what we now call the camera obscura, which is a natural phenomenon. It works much like the human eye, and I suppose the eye of many other animals. And it's basically light passing through an aperture, and in our modern inventions, through a lens to focus it. But that's optional. Light passing through an aperture, through a dark chamber, then projects an image onto a smooth surface. And this is what they say. There is evidence to suggest that this people from 30,000 years ago actually observed this phenomena, and it inspired cave paintings and influenced some of the cave paintings that they made. In later, yeah, let's first slide. Later on, they started making devices which they called camera obscura as well. So that term refers to two things. And you can see there the light going through a lens and an inverted image on a smooth surface. And right from that time, people had the desire to make this image permanent, to capture it in some way. And initially, this artist over here, which seems to be showing an awful lot of leg for that time, he is actually tracing that or copying that image. And that's the only way at the time that they could capture this image and make it permanent. And since then, there's been a great, all sorts of progress. People have tried to find other ways of doing this. And this was one of the first things that led to, one of two things that led to photography and printing as we know it now. The other one was a discovery around the early 1700s, where some clever people realized that certain substances, normally salts of some kind, silver salts, iron salts, change visually under exposure to various forms of light. So here we have light creating an image on a surface, and now people have figured out that that light can affect substances and record that image. So it took about another 100 odd years for someone to put all the pieces together. And that someone was called, what was his name? I've got it here somewhere. Joseph Niesford, yeah, in about 1826 or 27. And he called his process heliography. And it involved a pewter plate, which was coated in bitumen, which was sensitive to light. And this is the very first, what's credited today, and it's still in existence today, the very, very first permanent photographic print. And it's called The View from the Window at Le Gras. And it's basically a view from his apartment window. And yeah, somebody owns this and it's in a collection somewhere and it still exists. And that exposure, experts have discussed how long they thought this exposure would be. And some people estimate about 8 hours. And other people say because of certain aspects of light and that it must have been several days. So that's kind of open to debate. Another interesting thing about this, about the early types of photography, is that the print was direct. It's like getting a physical print straight out of your camera. There was nothing in between. There was obviously no digital image, but there was also no negative or anything like that. You created the print. If that was in a camera, you would take it out your camera and as it was. See where, okay, we can go to the next slide. In round about 1839, a person called Louis-Jacques Mande Daguerre, if that's pronounced correctly, he came up with this incredibly complicated process called the daguerreotype. And this is kind of, people still practice this today. And I don't know how he came up with this. He used polished silver-coated copper plates, iodine and bromide fumes, mercury vapor, etc., etc., etc. So like I said, these people must have been really motivated to do this, unless they'd been at the bromide fumes first, and then they decided to try and do this. So this image was created by an American photographer called Robert Cornelius. And this is credited as being the first selfie ever made. Also around about that time, 1840 something, because it was just after Daguerre came up with this process. And because the exposure times were so long, he could literally take the lens off the camera, like scoot around to the front, and then just stand really still for 15 minutes. Something which we would find really difficult to do these days, I think. And like I said, there's no negative or anything. So if he wants to like send this to his mom, a copy to his mom, he has to like run around again and stand there for another 15 minutes to get a second copy. You can't make a copy of this in any way other than redoing it. Okay. And these long exposures, I reckon, are probably the cause for like the early attempts at action photography not being very successful. Not just kidding. This is just something that I put in as a joke. Okay, next one. In roundabout 1842, a Sir John Herschel invented a process called cyanotype. There's a whole bunch of these processes, and I'm not going to go through all of them, I promise. But this one I'm going to mention because I'm very familiar with this. I do it. Bertie does it. And it's just a really simple process. It doesn't require dark rooms. It doesn't require, there's only 2 chemicals involved. And you can get remarkably crisp prints. And it only produces blue. So what you see here is an image created by Anna Atkins in 1843. And this was an illustration in the first photographically illustrated book ever produced. And it was a book about British algae. So what you see there is a specimen of algae that's been dried and then placed directly on sensitized paper. And wherever the algae stops the light from hitting the paper, that remains white. And wherever the light hit the paper, it turns blue. So yeah, that's an image from the very first ever photographically illustrated book. Cyanotypes, along with a lot of these earlier processes, they're what were called contact printing. Means whatever you're printing has to be in direct contact with the surface that you're printing onto. They didn't use enlargers or anything like that. So in this case, it was a physical object, and later on, when negatives were around, you would print you would print by placing your negative directly onto the surface, which means that you could only print the same size as your negative. So that has limited application. You think of 35 mil negs, you're going to get tiny little 35 mil images. Today, we can still do that, and we can do it with digital images because we can create digital negatives using printers and transparency paper. So as big as you can print, and as big as you can find transparency paper, you can create negatives that size. And Vertispin, what you've been printing at A3. Yeah. Yeah. What's this? Right. Okay, next one. This is another cyanotype, and cyanotypes were used really widely up until even the 1960s to create blueprints, which is where blueprints got their name from. And because architectural drawings were done on like a semi-translucent paper, you could place that down on sensitized paper, and wherever the black lines of the drawing were would remain white, as you can see there, and the rest would turn blue. And it was a very cost-effective way of making copies of blueprints that they didn't have any other way of really creating copies of. Photographers that ultimately printed in far more difficult and expensive processes often used cyanotype to proof their images because it was a inexpensive and quick way to do contact sheets and things like that. Whereas other processes like perhaps platinum, palladium cost an absolute fortune. So you don't want to be experimenting with those sorts of things. Okay. So cyanotypes, like I said, they're very simple. They don't require any darkroom or anything like that. So in the early 1900s, like 1920s or so, it was quite common. You could go into probably a pharmacist, I'm guessing, and buy a little cyanotype kit. And then you had your big box camera and you would take an image on your holiday and you would print it yourself using cyanotypes because all you need is sunlight and some water and these two chemicals. So cyanotype postcards were very common. People used to print their own postcards, send them to people. It was quite a common use for it then. Okay. And then this is just an example of the sort of clarity you actually can achieve with a cyanotype. Some of the older ones, they look a bit rough. And there is a second cyanotype process where they've altered the chemistry slightly in the 90s, which do give you sharper, clearer prints. But it's actually cyanotype and a lot of these other processes, they have had a real resurgence lately. And I think it's a bit of a response to digital. So, I mean, digital has so many advantages, but I think people miss the tactile experience of printmaking. So a lot of these old processes that are virtually unchanged for we're coming up to almost 200 years for cyanotypes are now have become very popular again, and people do them for all sorts of reasons. So, as I said, we're not going to stop along every process because there are so many of them. But what really changed the game was the whole silver process. To be more specific, silver salts suspended in gelatin. And that enabled a whole host of things that were not possible before. You could suddenly coat paper. You could coat glass, plastic, film. That's where negative film comes from, where positive film comes from for slides. That's all due to the silver salts suspended in gelatin. So previous to that, you couldn't coat these things with something as versatile that would stay there and be stable for a period of time. And this started in the late 1800s. No. Sorry, the screen, I lose my place on it all the time. Okay, yeah, so go to the next one. So that is an example of a very early um, silver print. And if any of us have worked in, I'm sure some of us here have worked in dark rooms and that before digital came along, and that's what we have been doing. So this whole silver process, it kind of dominated photography and printmaking for a century. The first commercially produced paper was manufactured in 1874. And that was pretty much what all of our photography was centered around until the sales of digital cameras overtook film cameras for the first time in 2005. So it's over a century that this was pretty much photography. Silver has also had a big resurgence. There's a lot of interest in film cameras, and you can still buy photographic papers and darkroom equipment and all the processing chemicals. And it's a real niche sort of thing. Again, I think it's a bit of a response to things like AI and digital and yeah. Um, so I mean, all of these classic photos. Oh yeah, silver was also used for color. Color. I was very surprised to find that color photography, the processes that are required for color were around as in the late 1800s. They were just completely impractical to use for most purposes. So most of the photography for the first 80 odd years was black and white. And then in the 60s, color became a lot more viable, and then color photography started to take over. Okay. Prior to the 60s, if you did want to color print, then it was very common to hand color photographs. So you would either print a black and white photograph or some other process like cyanotype. And this, in fact, is done by a modern artist, Christina Iotti. And her whole artistic practice is centered around cyanotypes of vintage negatives, which she then gets rid of the blue through a bleaching process and a toning process. And then she hand colors all of that with watercolor pencils. And she's a very active artist today. Okay. And then the last kind of stop on our short little history tour is the C-type or chromogenic print. So any color print that you had done in the last, since the 1960s would have used this process. It became very, very common, and it eventually overtook black and white as the standard of how we viewed our photographs. You can still get them made today from digital images. There's a whole technology around that. And I looked it up to give you an overview but I didn't understand it. It's a very, very complicated process. It, it has 3 layers of gelatin on the paper, and that includes silver halides and dye couplers of subtractive color. And I don't know. So we just leave that there. This is what you did when you got color photographs. Right. So yeah. So here we are in the present, and we have sort of a future which Terry's distant ancestor in his tent could never have imagined. The printing technology today is astounding. I mean, the printer that I have at home, which is not exactly like a lab printer or anything, it delivers 12 colors of ink through 18,000 nozzles. And it has technology to detect if any one of those nozzles is blocked and to compensate for that using other nozzles. It's just amazing, the quality and the technology that's involved. But if you do want to print yourself, or you want to get prints done, or you want to get a printer and print yourself, I'm just going to do a quick little overview of some terms that the most important things that you might need to know about. And the first one is you'll hear this word archival. And it generally refers to paper and ink. It can also refer to framing materials. But I'm sure you remember going through like your granny or grandpa's photo albums, and the black and white photos were all yellowed. And that's because paper has acids and other substances in it that cause that browning. So archival papers are special papers that have had the acids and the lignins and various other things removed. So they will eventually degrade and start to color, but instead of taking 20, 30 years, that process will now take 200 years with archival papers. Inks, that applies to inks as well. And with inks, you'll hear the terms dye-based and pigment-based inks. The dye-based inks are more common. That's probably what you're using with your home printer. And that is, it basically consists of colorants that are completely dissolved in the ink, in the carrier liquid. And that soaks right into the paper. And they characterized by very, very vibrant colors, but they can be prone a little bit to bleeding inside the paper. I mean, it's not something that you really, it's not a big bleed that you'll see, but images can lose just a hint of sharpness because of this bleeding that happens inside the paper. And they have a lifespan of around about 25 years if you kind of don't put them in the sun and stuff like that. Pigment-based inks, on the other hand, are much more expensive, and the printers that use them tend to be more expensive. And they consist of insoluble, tiny particles of pigment in the carrier liquid. And when the ink dries, it leaves behind these tiny little particles on top of the paper. It doesn't actually sink into the paper. And so you don't have problems like bleeding. And the colors tend to be not as vibrant, but they tend to be truer and richer because they're not replicas of a color. They're actual pigment. And they can last for like 200 years, and they are incredibly sharp, incredibly detailed, and a lot more expensive than dye-based inks. Another common question with printing is, how big can you print? And I wrestled with this for ages. And as with most good questions, the answer begins with, it depends. And there's two things I've found that really affect this. And the one is the quality of your image. And I'm sure we've all seen this. Some images are just sharper. They're just clearer. It's the light. It's your lens. It's planets being in alignment. I don't know. It's lack of atmospheric, humidity, smoke, all of these things. The closer your subject is to you, so there's not this atmospheric disturbance in between you and your subject. And obviously, when you blow these things up, all of those flaws in your image, much like what you were talking about with the salons, they become more visible. So you'll often hear advice from printers, from print labs, saying that you must print at 300 DPI, which comes from the print world of books and that sort of thing. But if you do the little calculation to work out, if you have to have 300 pixels in every inch, you can easily work out how big you can print your image. And for a 20 megapixel image, it's actually not that big. And yet you see these prints like that up on the wall there. So what's going on? And it's distance. So billboards that you drive past on the side of the road, if you walk up to them and look at them like this, you'll just see dots. But they printed at around about 10 DPI. But when you're sitting in your car, they look fine. And the same applies to our prints at home. So if you are deciding how big you can print, a key component is to think, what are you going to do with this print? Like, where are you going to hang it? Is it going to be in a book? You're going to be looking at it like this. Then it needs to be, then you're looking at maybe 300 DPI. But if you're going to hang it on the wall over there, and you're not going to stand up, and you're going to print it 1.5 meters wide by 1 meter, then you're not going to be pixel peeping at it with a magnifying glass. And it's amazing, even 1 meter or 2 away, and that graining that you get from blowing it up just disappears. And what you could do in Photoshop, if you tell Photoshop in the settings somewhere what your screen resolution is, then when you resize an image, let's say you want to print it you want to say, can I print this at 1.5 meters by 1 meter? Then you can resize the image in Photoshop, and then you can tell it to show it to you at real size. So like in Rob's case, he's only going to see half of his fly's eye on his screen, but you can see what that will look like. And then give it some space. Once you can see the eye there, then step back a couple of meters and see, what does it look like when I'm not staring it right in the eye. And so that to me is a key part of printing is, and I do that all the time because I print stuff, the biggest prints I've done are about 1.5 meters by a meter. And some images you just simply can't go that big. And I can only do them at A2, for example. But I always check by doing that. And then I always get the print lab to check as well. But they've never come back and said, after I've checked it in Photoshop like that, they've never come back and said, oh no, this is awful, don't print it. Yeah, no, stay there. If you're going to print yourself, then 90% of the problems that you have with reproducing to a reasonable degree what you see on the screen come down to two factors. And the one is ICC profiles. An ICC profile is basically a color characteristic profile, and it applies to all sorts of devices, your monitor, your projector, all that sort of thing. And in the printing world, they're produced by the paper manufacturers, and they're specific to a paper printer combination. So they'll produce an ICC profile for, let's say, Hahn-Müller Photorag, 308 grams. They'll produce one for a Canon Pro 1000 and an Epson whatever, and all the printers, you'll get a separate ICC profile. And when you print, you tell the software to use, you install it on your computer, and you tell the printing software to use that profile, and it translates between. It helps the printer reproduce colors on that paper. So it's designed to take the characteristics of the paper into account, and so that the printer can reproduce colors that will look true on this paper. And Lightroom and Photoshop, they have things called soft proofing. So if you install an ICC profile for your particular paper, then you can, in Lightroom, for example, you can soft proof, and it'll attempt to show you, apply that ICC profile to what you're seeing on the screen. So you can it's not foolproof. And some photo labs also provide ICC profiles for their printing process. So you can install that and say, look, okay, if I'm going to send them this, then I can approximate what it'll look like once they're printed on this paper. The other thing is media types. So ICC profiles describe color. Media types describe the physical characteristics of the paper or canvas or whatever you're printing on. The thickness of the paper. How high does the printer head need to be to accommodate this paper? How much ink can this paper take? Because papers can take different amounts of ink. And if you use the wrong media type, then you'll get things like the print head hitting the paper because your paper is thicker than the printer thought it was. And you'll get smudges, and you'll get ink that prints where there's too much ink and it doesn't dry and it smears, and all those sorts of problems can be solved by selecting the right media type. So printers normally come with media types that cover a range. Some printer manufacturers create them, or they tell you which one to use for a specific paper. So I print on Hahn-Müller Photorag a lot, and with the ICC profile, they tell me on the Canon Pro 1000, use the fine art highest density media type. And then that will tell the printer where to put the head, how much ink to deliver, all of that sort of stuff. So using ICC profiles and media types will solve most of your printing woes. And that'll be the main reason why you're getting prints that look nothing like what you're seeing on the screen, is because you're not using those. But given where we are today, and this is kind of the main point of this talk, a lot of the stuff, you can look up when you need to make a print. You can look up a lot of these things. But to me, the main question is, we're drowning in images these days. We have so many images. We create so many images. And we have a dazzling array of options to look at them and to share them immediately in amazing resolution. Social media, and it's, why would we print? And to me, the main answer to that question is because some prints, some images, some photographs are just really special. And they just deserve to be seen in a different way. They can be special for what they portray, or what they mean to us, or what they remind us of. Okay? Some images can literally change the world. Yep. They can preserve the essence of a person and bring that person back to us, whether it's someone we knew or whether it's someone whose music we appreciated, like Miles Davis, who's a legend, and to see something like that, I think you get a sense of who he was and what his music meant to him. And images like this, to me, make the world a much richer place. Okay. They tell the story of a place and a time, and that's Frida Kahlo. And they interpret the world around us and present it to us from a perspective that we may not have ever considered before. Okay. And they show us humanity and people from different walks of life that we may have never thought we have a connection with or never felt a connection with. But they could show us the humanity in those people and make us empathic and sensitive to other people's lives and experiences. Okay. And some images, these special images, to me, they deserve more than a fleeting glance on social media or having to go into your photo collection or viewing on the web. They're the types of images that I think to have on your wall and to see every time you walk into a room is I think they affect our lives. And the more you see an image and the more different contexts you see it in, you're not always, when you see an image on the wall, you're not always thinking about photography. You could be thinking about something else. You could have just watched a movie. And then you see an image that tells a story like that. And the meaning in the photograph deepens the more times you see it, and it changes. And it makes us think about different things. And to me, that's one of the real values in print, is that it's showing us images in contexts which we wouldn't normally see them, and in the context of our everyday lives. Okay. When you print an image, I also feel like it takes on a life of its own, becomes, and this is kind of like a soft issue, a bit of an ephemeral sort of thing, but it makes it more concrete and it makes it into an actual tangible, tactile piece of art. I mean, sometimes it actually can be amazing to hold a print. You don't want to do this too often, but if you're doing your own prints, to touch it and to feel it. The paper has texture and the ink feels a certain way. And photographers are artists, and the print medium that they choose is often very carefully chosen, whether it's a paper or a canvas or an old print process from 100 years ago that makes an image relatively blurry. That's all part of what they're ultimately trying to express. And a print captures not only what you were thinking and feeling and seeing when you took the photograph, but it also captures and expresses what you were thinking and feeling when you made the print, which can be quite different. And obviously with digital images, you can do that as well. You can reprocess your image, but it always feels like it's there for another little tweak, and you can change it. And you often don't ever go back and look at what it was like 4 steps back in the history. Whereas a print is a statement in time of which doesn't change. Okay. There should be one more. Oh, right. So when I was living in London in the early 2000s, I went to a large exhibition of Ansel Adams' work. He was one of my favorite photographers. And talking about photography changing the world, the images of Ansel Adams had a profound effect on conservation the world over. And parks in the US, like Yosemite, they exist, and well, they existed before, but they were very small, and it was largely due to his images and what his images showed people about the world around them, that these parks were expanded exponentially through funding and governments. His photography influenced all of that and created this conservation movement. But what I found really interesting about his images at this exhibition is they had images, the same image printed early in his life and early in his career and printed late in his career. And while it was exactly the same image from exactly the same negative, they were entirely different. And what they expressed was entirely different. And it's really reflected how he had changed over his life and over his career. And you wouldn't I mean, it's possible, but you probably wouldn't experience that with digital images. And so I love that about prints, that they extend the expression of our photography and they capture it in a moment in time. This is the last one, actually. I think printing can also inform our photography. Now, when you're thinking of the print as an end result, you consider different things when if you're out with your camera and you're experiencing something and your goal is you're picturing an image on your wall, that informs what you're doing in a different way than it might if you're planning just to leave it on your PC, for example. So, like I said, seeing it on a wall, you see it over and over again, and our impressions of our photography, of our own photography, changes when you see it all the time, and you have new ideas. It sparks creativity, and I think studies have shown actually that people viewing a physical image, a print, and viewing a digital version of the same thing on a screen, they actually have a different level of recall of the event if it was something familiar to them, and deeper responses to it when it's physical in print. And I think printing your images and putting them up where you can see them is a fantastic way to improve your photography and to improves a very subjective word, but to deepen what you are saying with your photography. So the next time you go out with your camera, just try thinking about if you were going to put this on your wall, what would you want to be saying? Because every photograph says something. And I think prints help us a lot. The physical aspect of prints help us enormously to hear what that photograph is saying. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Jason. Thank you very much, Jason. Let me just see if there's a message here. Does anyone here have any questions?